There's a lamp somewhere near you right now, maybe on a nightstand, maybe across the room, throwing a small circle of warm light onto a wall or a stack of books. I want you to picture it clearly, just for a second, and then let it go soft and blurry at the edges, the way lamps do right before sleep. That's the mood we're settling into. Tonight, we're drifting through the complete fall of the Jedi Order. Not just the one terrible night everybody thinks of, the night the clone troopers turned on their generals, but the much longer, much quieter story underneath it. Because here's the thing I want to put in its place before anything else tonight. The Jedi didn't fall in a single night. They fell across more than 1,000 years, slowly, one small compromise at a time. And a lot of fans, genuinely, this is a real, ongoing argument people have, believe that the very rules built to protect the Jedi from themselves are exactly what left them blind when it mattered most. So tonight, we're going to lay that whole story out, piece by piece, like tidying a room before bed. The High Republic, at the very peak of the Jedi's power and goodness. The rule against attachment, and why it existed. The slow rot in the Republic they served. And then, softly, at the very end, the night everything came apart. We'll draw on the films, on the Clone Wars, and on the High Republic novels, and I'll always tell you clearly which parts are settled fact and which parts are theory. Things fans argue about, turn over in their hands, disagree on. You don't need to remember any of it. There's no quiz waiting for you at the end of this, no test in the morning. If you drift off 6 minutes from now and miss the rest, that is not a failure of this video. That is the video working exactly as intended. So, get comfortable, let your shoulders drop an inch, and let's start setting the room. I like starting a long story the way you'd start tidying a room you haven't touched in a while. You don't just dive into the mess. You find one clear surface first, put one thing down on it, and let that give you a place to stand. So, let's do that. The first thing I want to put down, clearly in its place, is this. Everything we call the fall of the Jedi gets compressed, in most people's memory, into one image. Anakin Skywalker walking down the long corridor of the Jedi Temple with his lightsaber lit. Younglings looking up at him with no idea what's coming. That's Revenge of the Sith, 2005. And it is real. It is confirmed. It happened exactly as shown. But that image is the very last page of a very long book. Tonight, I want to open the book from the beginning. The second thing I want to put down is the timeline itself, just so it has a shelf to sit on. Star Wars canon, the officially recognized story, as opposed to the older Legends material Lucasfilm set aside after Disney's acquisition, now stretches back through an era called the High Republic, roughly 2 centuries before the events of the Phantom Menace. That's the peak. That's the Jedi Order at its most trusted, most competent, most beloved by the ordinary people of the galaxy. A kind of golden afternoon light before anything starts going wrong. Then comes a long, grinding decline through the last years of the Republic, the era the prequel films actually show us. Naboo, then the Clone Wars, then the Empire rising out of the ashes. Then, past that, the era of the original trilogy, where the Jedi are nearly extinct, remembered mostly as myth. Tonight, we're going to walk that whole corridor slowly, from the golden afternoon all the way to the dark. And the third thing I want to put down, before we start walking, is the actual question underneath tonight's story, the one fans keep circling. Was the Jedi Order murdered, ambushed by a Sith Lord who spent decades hiding inside their own government? Or did the Order, in some slower and sadder way, help kill itself, long before the clones ever raised their weapons? I don't think the answer is a clean one. I think it's probably both, tangled together, and we'll hold that thought loosely and come back to it near the end, once we've actually seen the evidence laid out room by room. That's really all tonight is, laying the evidence out, gently, in order, until the whole shape of it is visible. And by the time it is, I suspect you'll be long asleep, which is exactly the plan. A little further in, I want to pause once, just once, and ask you something, out of genuine curiosity, nothing more. Where are you tonight? What country? What time zone? What hour is it where you're lying right now? I like knowing that somewhere out there, in whatever time zone you're in, it's late, and you've chosen this, of all things, to fall asleep to. That's a nice thought. Hold it for a second, then let's keep going. If you find these kinds of long, slow histories useful for sleep, following or subscribing is a quiet way to have more of them waiting for you. But that's the only time, I want to say, the only time I'll mention it, and then we go back to just being quiet together in the story. The High Republic. Let's set this room up properly, because it's a good room, and it deserves to be looked at before we move on, and, eventually, watch it get taken apart. Picture Coruscant, but calmer than you've ever seen it in the films, because the films you know don't actually show you this era at all. This is roughly 200 years before The Phantom Menace, and Lucasfilm built it out from 2021 onward as a whole publishing initiative. Novels, comics, a couple of streaming shows, specifically to show fans what the Jedi looked like before anything had gone wrong. Not mythic elder statesmen guarding a dying flame, the way Obi-Wan and Yoda feel in the original trilogy. Something closer to a well-run emergency service with unusually good manners. Confirmed canon, not legends, not speculation. This is the era Lucasfilm chose, deliberately, to answer the question, what were they like at their best? The central symbol of the whole era is a space station called Starlight Beacon, and I like starting here because it's such a plain, tidy idea for a beacon of hope. It's literally a lighthouse. It hangs at the edge of the outer rim, in a stretch of largely unmapped, dangerous space, glowing, visible for light years, built jointly by the Jedi and the Republic as a promise to frontier worlds that used to feel forgotten. Someone is watching. Someone will come if you call. There's a Jedi Master named Stellan Gios, who becomes one of its central figures. Exactly the sort of steady, likeable, slightly too perfect knight you'd want running a lighthouse. The kind of man other Jedi describe, admiringly, as never having a bad day. Hold on to him gently. We'll need him again later, and not for a happy reason. And there's Avar Kriss, a Jedi Marshal, probably the closest thing this era has to a lead character across the earliest novels. Charles Soule's Light of the Jedi, from January 2021, is really where this whole initiative begins. And Avar is at the center of it. She's known, among other things, for something the books call the Jedi Force Meld. Dozens of Jedi joining their minds together across vast distances to work as a single coordinated instrument, which is a genuinely lovely image if you let it sit with you. Not lone heroes, but something more like a choir. That's the High Republic's whole self-image, really. Not chosen ones. A choir. Here's the event that actually opens the story. The thing that gives Avar and everyone else their first real test, and it's called the Great Hyperspace Disaster. A civilian transport called the Legacy Run, carrying passengers on a routine hyperspace jump, suffers a catastrophic failure and rips itself apart mid-jump, scattering wreckage, moving at faster than light speed, toward inhabited worlds across a huge stretch of the galaxy. It is, structurally, a disaster movie. Dozens of Jedi scrambling in ships and with raw power alone to intercept flaming debris before it slams into planets full of people who have no idea anything is wrong. And they largely succeed. That's the important part. This isn't the Jedi arriving too late, or failing quietly, the way so much of tonight's later story will be. This is the Jedi doing exactly what they were built to do. Well, together, in public, and being thanked for it afterward by grateful, ordinary citizens who trust them completely. If you ever wanted one image of peak Jedi, this disaster response might honestly be it. Competence without cruelty, still a little breathless with how good they feel doing it. But, and here's where the room starts to get a little more interesting, the way tidy rooms sometimes do once you actually open the drawers. The Legacy Run disaster wasn't really an accident. It's later revealed to be the opening move of a group called the Nihil. And I think this is the part of the High Republic that fans who love it talk about most, because the Nihil aren't the Sith. They're not a dark mirror of the Jedi at all. They're something closer to a marauding raider fleet, part pirates, part cult, held together less by ideology than by a promise. Join us, and you get to take whatever you want, and we'll help you get away with it. Their leader, revealed gradually across the books and comics, is a figure named Martian Rowe. And what makes him unusual as a Star Wars villain, genuinely unusual, this isn't a small thing, is that he isn't Force sensitive at all. He's not a Sith apprentice waiting in the shadows. He's just a man who found a way to weaponize something the Jedi, for all their choir-like coordination, hadn't accounted for. Unpredictability. The Nihil use stolen, irregular hyperspace routes and stripped down, disposable ships to appear where no one expects them, strike fast, and vanish before help, before Starlight Beacon's lighthouse glow of reassurance can arrive. I want to slow down on that, just for a second, because I think it's the first quiet crack in the peak, even while the peak is still technically happening. The Jedi of this era are magnificent at responding to disasters. They're less prepared for a disaster designed, on purpose, by someone studying exactly how they respond. That's not a flaw in any one Jedi's character. It's closer to what happens to any very good, very established system. A fire department, a hospital, an empire. Once someone patient enough comes along and studies its habits instead of its strength. You don't have to remember any of that, by the way. It's just a nice, quiet thought to have going into the rest of tonight. There's another Jedi from this stretch of the story I want to put down carefully, because he matters more than his page count might suggest. Elzar Mann, a Jedi Knight who becomes one of the more emotionally complicated figures in these early novels. Someone who starts to feel uncomfortably early for a Jedi at the height of the Order's confidence. That the neat lines the code draws around feeling aren't quite wide enough for what he actually experiences. He isn't punished for this in any dramatic way, not yet. It's subtler than that, more like a low hum underneath an otherwise gorgeous piece of music, something you'd only notice if you already knew, the way we do tonight, what the ending looks like. And there's Skier, a Trandoshan Jedi Master, gruff and weathered, who over the course of the books is shown wrestling, quite literally, physically and spiritually, with something the novels call the Nihil's nameless creatures, strange Force null beings that don't merely resist the Force, but seem to actively devour a Jedi's connection to it, leaving them able to feel fear again in a way their training was supposed to have smoothed away years earlier. That detail always stays with me. An enemy whose whole power is to make a Jedi ordinary again, afraid again, for the first time since childhood. I mention the nameless creatures because I think they're one of the most quietly unsettling ideas the High Republic material introduces. And it's worth sitting with. Why? The entire architecture of Jedi training, everything we'll spend more time on shortly, the code, the detachment, the careful decades of teaching a child to set fear gently to one side rather than be ruled by it, depends on the Force being reliably there to lean on. It's the floor they all stand on. And here, right at what's supposed to be the Order's confident high summer, canon quietly introduces creatures whose entire trick is pulling that floor away, one Jedi at a time, and showing them what they're like without it. You don't need to hold on to the name Nameless, or Skier, or any of it specifically. I just find it a strangely tender detail to fall asleep on. The idea that even at their most golden, the Jedi already had something out there that knew exactly where their foundations were thin. There's a later flashpoint in this era, still within the same broadly agreed High Republic timeline, called the Battle of Jeddah. Jeddah being the same dusty, sacred, temple-covered moon you might already picture from Rogue One, centuries later, half in ruins by then. In the High Republic period, it's still a living holy site, one of the galaxy's great pilgrimage destinations, home to faiths that predate the Jedi Order itself, and the Nihil's assault on it during this era is treated in the books as one of the genuine turning points of the conflict. A direct strike, not just at people, but at a place that mattered spiritually to species who had nothing to do with the Jedi, or the Republic at all. I raise it mostly to make a small, quiet point. Even at their peak, the Jedi weren't the only sacred thing in this galaxy, and weren't always the ones under attack. Sometimes, they were simply the ones who arrived, again, to help, because that's what the lighthouse is for. So let's step back for a moment and just look at the room we've set up, all the pieces sitting where we've put them. A Jedi Order at the height of its reputation, glowingly trusted by ordinary citizens across a huge stretch of the galaxy, coordinating like a single instrument through force-sensitive marshals like Avar Kriss, running literal lighthouses on the frontier, responding beautifully to disaster. And, tucked into the same room, almost too quiet to notice yet, a raider leader who isn't even force-sensitive, but has learned to study and exploit their patterns. A Jedi Knight beginning to privately doubt whether the code's emotional lines are drawn correctly. Creatures whose entire purpose seems to be showing Jedi what fear feels like again. None of these are the Fall. I want to be honest with you about that, because I don't want to oversell any single detail into more than it is. The High Republic novels do not end with the Jedi Order collapsing, and the Nihil are eventually defeated as a galactic threat within that same era. This isn't decline yet. This is still the golden afternoon, but it's worth noticing gently, the way you'd notice a hairline crack in a ceiling you otherwise love, that the seeds of the very rules that will later leave the Order blind are already sitting in this room, fully formed, mistaken for furniture. The code that tells a Jedi like Elzar Mann to set feeling aside rather than examine it. The confidence that tells an Order this competent, this trusted, this good at responding to what it can see coming, that it doesn't need to spend much time wondering what it can't see coming. 2 centuries stand between this moment and Anakin Skywalker walking that long corridor with his lightsaber lit. 2 centuries is a long time. long enough for a small crack to become something structural, if nobody's really looking at the ceiling, because the room, after all, still feels so warm and so well lit and so entirely, deservedly beloved. So, let's pick up the next piece and turn it over in our hands before we set it down, because this is the part where I want to actually show you the rules themselves. Not just gesture at the idea that rules existed, but hold up the actual furniture of the Jedi Order and look at what it was built from, back when someone still believed every piece of it was load-bearing. Here's a good place to start, because it's the piece most people already have somewhere in a drawer, even if they've never opened a Star Wars book in their life: the Jedi Code. The version most fans can recite along with, even half asleep, goes something like this. There is no emotion, there is peace. There is no ignorance, there is knowledge. There is no passion, there is serenity. There is no chaos, there is harmony. There is no death, there is the Force. 5 lines. You could write it on a single index card. And I think that's worth sitting with for a second, because whole religious traditions in the real world have taken thousands of years and thousands of pages to try to say something like this. And here it is, distilled down to something you could recite while brushing your teeth, which either means it's a beautifully compressed truth, or it means something got left out in the compression. I gently suggest, and this really is just me thinking out loud with you, not a verified fact, just a place my mind goes at 1 in the morning, that it might be a bit of both. Notice the shape of each line, if you're still with me and not already halfway into a dream. It's not there is less emotion, it's not there is calmer passion. Each line takes something that most living beings feel constantly, all day, without asking permission: emotion, ignorance, passion, chaos, death, and replaces it cleanly with its opposite, as if the first thing simply stops existing once the second one arrives, as if peace doesn't grow alongside emotion, or somehow underneath it, but instead only shows up once the emotion has been asked to leave the room. That's a very particular kind of philosophy. It's not wrong exactly. Plenty of real-world contemplative traditions build toward something similar, a stillness that sits underneath the noise. But it's a demanding architecture to raise a child inside, and that's exactly what the Jedi Order did for thousands of years, on a scale most of us would find almost unimaginable if it weren't dressed up in robes and lightsabers. Because here's the practical detail, and this one is very much confirmed by the films themselves, not a theory at all. Jedi were, as a matter of standard practice, identified and taken in as infants, found Force-sensitive, sometimes through the natural curiosity of an existing Jedi, noticing a strange gift in a very small child, and brought to the temple on Coruscant to be raised there from the very beginning, with the older bonds of family gently, deliberately set aside in favor of the temple becoming the whole of a child's world. You can feel how tidy that solution is if you're the one designing an order meant to last for 1,000 generations and stay morally uncorrupted the entire time. If a person never really knows the pull of a mother's love, a father's worry, a sibling's rivalry, then that person, presumably, never has to fight against those pulls later, when the stakes are a burning system or a besieged planet. It's a bit like deciding the safest way to keep a room dust-free forever is to never let anyone move in. Efficient. Also, obviously, a little sad if you let yourself sit in it, rather than admire the cleanliness of the idea. And this is exactly where Anakin Skywalker becomes such an uncomfortable exception right from the start. And I don't mean that as foreshadowing so much as just a fact sitting there, plainly, in the very first film he appears in. He wasn't found as an infant. He was found at 9 years old, already a person, already someone's son, with a mother he could clearly picture and clearly missed, and was, by the Order's own logic, never really supposed to have been let in at that age at all. You can watch this tension play out directly on screen. Yoda's hesitation is not subtle, and it's not really resolved so much as overruled, mostly on the strength of Qui-Gon Jinn's conviction that this particular boy mattered enough to bend the rule for, which means, and I think this is one of the quietly devastating little details in the whole saga if you slow down enough to notice it, that the exact thing the Order's founding rule on attachment was built to prevent. A Jedi who remembers vividly what it felt like to love a parent and be separated from them, walked in through the front door of the temple as a known, acknowledged exception, and everyone involved in making that exception is later, one way or another, gone by the time it matters most. I want to pause here, gently, and ask you something that has nothing to do with lightsabers at all. I'm genuinely curious. In the quiet, unnosy way you get curious about a stranger on a late train. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? What country? What time zone? What hour is it actually pressing against your window right now? I like picturing it, if I'm honest. All these different dark rooms scattered across a spinning planet. Curtains drawn in some places. Blinds cracked to a streetlight in others. Someone may be in a car park on a night shift break. Someone else properly tucked into bed with a partner already asleep beside them. All of you drifting toward the same story at wildly different local hours. You don't need to tell me, obviously. I can't hear you. That's not how this works. And even if I could, this isn't really the moment for conversation. But it's a nice thing to hold for a second. Wherever you are, whatever time it says on the little glowing clock near your bed, you've arrived here the same way. Tired, looking for something calm to listen to in the dark. That's a kind of company, even at a distance. Alright, let's drift back. So, attachment. This is the rule that, more than any other single piece of Jedi philosophy, gets argued over by fans, and for good reason, because, unlike the 5 clean lines of the code, this rule shows its work on screen, out loud, in a scene most people who've seen the films even once can call up from memory. Anakin, older now, a Jedi Knight in Attack of the Clones, troubled by a dream about his mother, goes to Yoda for guidance. The way you might go to an old teacher with something heavy on your chest expecting comfort. And Yoda's answer, and this is a real direct quote from the film, not a paraphrase. Attachment leads to jealousy, the shadow of greed, that is. Death is a natural part of life. Rejoice for those around you who transform into the Force. Mourn them, do not. Miss them, do not. Attachment is forbidden. Train yourself to let go of everything you fear to lose. I'd like you to just sit in that for a moment, the way I try to whenever I come back to this scene, because it's not cruel advice, not exactly. And Yoda isn't written as a villain here. He's offering the honest, load-bearing philosophy of an order that has kept its members steady through wars, temptations, and centuries of power without collapsing into the kind of corruption that swallowed the Sith over and over again. There's real wisdom tucked in there about impermanence, about the danger of clinging so hard to what you love that you'd burn down anything to keep it. And if you strip away the lightsabers, That's not so different from ideas you'd find in plenty of real contemplative traditions, the ones that talk about non-attachment as a form of freedom rather than a form of loss. But listen to what it's actually asking a specific, grieving young man to do with a very specific, very human fear about his mother. Don't miss her. Don't mourn her, even privately, even quietly, even just to yourself in a dark room like this one. Let go now, before you've even lost her, of the fear that you might. That's an enormous thing to ask of anyone, let alone someone who was 9 years old when he walked through that door with the memory of her voice still fresh enough to dream about. And here's a detail I find almost unbearably poignant once you notice it. And it's right there in the plainest reading of the films, no theory required. Anakin doesn't reject this teaching outright, doesn't storm off and abandon the order over it. He tries. He goes back to Tatooine anyway, against the letter of what Yoda's told him, driven by that same dream, and arrives too late, his mother dying in his arms after being held captive by Tusken raiders. And what follows is one of the darker, quieter turns in the whole saga. Anakin, in his grief and rage, kills every member of that Tusken camp, not just the ones responsible, and later admits it to Padme in his own words, describing them cruelly as animals. It's worth being honest about that scene rather than softening it, because it's exactly the thing the Order's rule was built to prevent, playing out almost as a demonstration reel. Attachment, unprocessed and unexamined, because the philosophy around him offered him no real place to put it, curdling straight into the kind of violence the code claimed serenity was supposed to make impossible. I don't say that to make Anakin simply a villain in this telling, and I don't think the films ask us to either. I say it because it's a genuinely uncomfortable, genuinely real piece of evidence for the theory some fans hold. And I want to be clear, that's exactly what this is. A theory, a reading, not a verified moral of the story handed down by Lucasfilm. That the ban on attachment didn't protect Anakin from the dark side so much as it left him alone with a grief he had no sanctioned language for, and no permission to even name out loud in front of the people meant to guide him. Let's set that particular piece down carefully, because it's a heavy one, and pick up something a little lighter-handed before we keep moving. The Order's own description of itself, which is where the tidiness of this philosophy shows its more admirable side. There's a line from Attack of the Clones, spoken by Mace Windu in a council scene about the growing separatist crisis, that I think deserves to sit right alongside the attachment scene as the other half of the Order's whole self-understanding. We're keepers of the peace, not soldiers. 4 words doing an enormous amount of work. The Jedi, by their own founding philosophy, were never meant to be a military force at all. They were meant to be something closer to circuit judges, mediators, guardians who occasionally had to fight, but whose entire ethical training was built around the idea that fighting was the last tool in the box, not the first one, and never, ever the identity. That's a genuinely lovely piece of institutional self-image, and for most of the Order's long history, by every account we have, it more or less held true. Jedi resolved disputes on the edges of the map. Jedi negotiated. Jedi occasionally ignited a lightsaber. But the whole training, the whole culture, was built around the assumption that this would remain the exception, a tool reached for rarely, by people whose real skill was in not needing it. Which makes it worth just quietly noticing, without any drama attached, how strange it is that the very same council chamber, in that same film, in that very same conversation, ends with the Jedi Order agreeing to lead an army, an actual, standing, clone army, raised in secret on Camino, ships in the air over Geonosis within the hour. Keepers of the peace, not soldiers, spoken and then, almost immediately, structurally, become exactly that. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that's a betrayal of everything the Order stood for, because the film is careful to show it as something closer to a trap with no clean way out. Count Dooku's separatists were already mobilized. The Republic's own survival was genuinely on the table. And the Jedi were, in that specific moment, the only ones capable of leading a defense at all. But it's exactly the kind of quiet contradiction I keep circling tonight. The kind of small unmarked object left sitting in the middle of an otherwise beautifully tidy room. A founding philosophy built entirely around restraint, around the idea that a Jedi's highest skill is knowing when not to draw the blade, absorbed almost overnight into 3 brutal years of full-scale war, fought with soldiers who were never even given the choice to be there. We'll get to those 3 years properly, and to what they cost, a little further along tonight. For now, I just want to leave this one rule sitting where we found it. A little scuffed, a little more complicated than its own 5 clean lines suggested. Not because the Jedi's founding philosophy was foolish. I don't think it was. I think there's real beauty and real discipline in an order that tried, across 1,000 generations, to build peace out of something steadier than fear. But a philosophy this demanding needs, more than almost anything else, people willing to keep questioning it, gently, from the inside, the way you'd keep checking a ceiling you love for cracks, rather than simply trusting that a room this well lit could never really need the checking at all. So, let's set the next object down gently, right beside the rule we just left there, because it belongs in the same corner of the room. Picture, for a moment, a shelf of very fine glassware, the kind you inherit rather than buy, the kind that gets wrapped in tissue paper and only comes out for the good dinners. That's roughly what the High Republic era looks like in the record at its actual peak. And the finest piece on that shelf, the one historians and fans both keep picking up and turning over in the light, is a single event and a single new institution built in response to it, that together tell you almost everything about what the Jedi were capable of when they were working exactly as designed. And, very quietly, tucked behind that shelf, in shadow, something else was already moving. The event is usually called the Great Disaster, and it's the opening set piece of Charles Soule's 2021 novel, Light of the Jedi, which was written specifically to launch this whole High Republic era of storytelling, confirmed, real, that's simply when and why this material exists. Here's the picture. A hyperspace transport called the Legacy Run, carrying passengers and cargo, suffers a catastrophic failure while traveling faster than light. It doesn't just crash, it's flung apart, and its wreckage, its actual physical debris, still carrying that terrible hyperspace momentum, reintegrates into normal space right on top of an inhabited system called Hetzal, which means, very simply and very horribly, that pieces of a broken ship start raining down out of nowhere onto planets that had no warning at all. Ships in orbit are torn apart by debris moving faster than anything should move. It is, structurally, one disaster wearing the shape of 100 smaller ones, scattered across an entire system all at once. And the Jedi response to that is, genuinely, one of the most beautiful sequences in all of this material. And I mean that gently, rather than as hype. It's simply a lovely thing to picture as you're falling asleep. Jedi across that system reach out and, working together, use the Force to physically slow falling wreckage, to hold pieces of broken hyperspace freighter in the air long enough for people underneath to get clear, to guide crippled ships down instead of letting them fall. Master Avar Kriss, a human Jedi who becomes one of the central figures of this whole era, is shown coordinating dozens of Jedi across vast distances, almost like a conductor holding a very large, very frightened orchestra together, note by note, so that nothing comes down out of time. It's the keepers of the peace ideal made completely literal, not soldiers fighting an enemy, but a scattered order of quiet specialists doing the unglamorous work of catching a falling sky together, because that's simply what they were for. If you're enjoying drifting through this with me tonight, by the way, following along for more of these to fall asleep to is always a nice, quiet thing to do later. No rush, just leaving the door open. Now, here's where the tidying gets complicated, because a room doesn't stay tidy just because you've put one thing carefully back in its place. Because the great disaster wasn't, in the end, simply an accident. The wreckage of the Legacy Run reintegrating into real space over an inhabited system wasn't bad luck, though it took the Jedi and the Republic some time in the story to realize that. It was connected. The novels draw this thread out slowly, rather than announcing it, to a group called the Nihil, and this is where I want to slow right down, because the Nihil are, in a very real sense, the shadow this whole shining era was cast against. The Nihil are raiders, marauders, if you want the word the books themselves reach for. They operate on the fringes of Republic space, and their whole method depends on a piece of stolen or adapted hyperspace technology that lets them do something ordinary ships can't. Cut in and out of hyperspace lanes at points nobody else can predict, appearing where they shouldn't be able to appear, vanishing the same way. It's a chilling little mechanical detail once you sit with it. The Nihil's entire terror, their whole reputation, rests on the simple fact that in a galaxy where travel follows charted, trusted routes, they'd found a way to break the rules of the road, and nobody flying those routes had any way to see them coming until they already had. There's a line the Nihil are known for saying to the ships they corner, a small phrase that stuck with a lot of readers precisely because of how calm and almost polite it sounds. "We see you." 2 words. No warning shot, no demand, just the confirmation, delivered gently, that you'd already been found. And the great disaster, it turns out, across the unfolding story, traces back to exactly this. Nihil experimentation with that same unstable hyperspace technology, pushing it further than it could safely go, is what set the Legacy Run's destruction in motion in the first place. Which means the single most shining moment of Jedi heroism this era produces, the Hetzel rescue, the conductor holding the falling orchestra together, happens because of damage the Nihil caused, whether or not they fully intended that particular catastrophe. The peak and the shadow arrive in the very same chapter. That's not me imposing a neat symmetry on the story for effect. That's simply how Charles Soule structured the book, and it's worth just noticing, quietly, how much that structural choice tells you about what this whole era of storytelling was for. It wasn't written to show the Jedi at their best in a vacuum. It was written to show the Jedi at their best precisely because something was already loose in the galaxy that their best wasn't necessarily built to catch. The Nihil, in these early books, don't have one single obvious leader standing at a lectern the way the Sith usually do with their rule of 2 and their tidy line of masters and apprentices. They're structured almost like weather systems, Tempest runners, they're called. Warlords, each commanding their own raiding fleet, answering, at least nominally, to something called the Eye of the Nihil, a title that functions almost as much as myth as a person. And there's a figure moving through these early books named Martian Rowe, son of a former Nihil leader named Asgar Rowe, who inherits from his father an old device, a comm, essentially, that lets him intercept and understand Nihil communications no one else can read. It's a small, unglamorous piece of inherited hardware, and it is, as the story develops across these novels, exactly how a fairly minor figure begins quietly gathering the kind of leverage that lets him start climbing toward real power inside an organization that isn't supposed to have a throne at all. I'll say plainly that some of the finer details of exactly how the Nihil's internal power structure works, and exactly how mythical or real that I title turns out to be, get filled in gradually across many books, rather than all at once in light of the Jedi itself. So hold the specifics loosely, the way you'd hold a story a friend is still in the middle of telling you, but the shape of it is clear and it's real. A raider network built around unpredictability and fear, slowly being pulled together, tightened, personalized, by one patient man with his father's old radio. And here's the quiet thing I keep circling back to about all this, the reason it belongs on the same shelf as everything else we've set down tonight. The High Republic, in this era, responds to the Nihil the way you'd expect an order of peacekeepers and negotiators to respond, with rescue, with structure, with an actual physical symbol of reassurance. Not long after the Great Disaster, the Republic and the Jedi together build something called Starlight Beacon, a vast station stationed out on the frontier, right at the edge of explored space, meant as a literal beacon, a promise, visible from a long way off, that help exists out here, that the frontier isn't abandoned, that the light reaches this far. Avar Kriss becomes its marshal. It's an enormously hopeful piece of architecture, and it's exactly what an order built around peace, not war, would build in response to a threat. Not a fortress, not a weapon, but a lighthouse. But a lighthouse only helps you if the danger announces itself by being visible. And the entire design of the Nihil, the whole point of their stolen hyperspace tricks, their unpredictable raids, their calm little "we see you," is that they don't work by being seen. They work by seeing first. Which means the Jedi's instinctive, decent, characteristic answer to this new shadow. Build something bright. Build something that reassures. Build something people can look toward. Was, from the very start, answering a problem that wasn't really about darkness at all. It was about blind spots, and an order whose whole founding philosophy runs on serenity, on trust in the will of the Force, on not grasping too hard at control or certainty, is, and I say this with real tenderness for them, not criticism, not naturally built to go looking for blind spots. They're built to stay calm inside whatever room they're already in. Nobody had quite taught them yet to wonder what might be standing just outside it, watching, patient, taking notes, waiting for a much, much better moment. So let's set the next thing down, carefully, the way you'd set a good plate on a shelf you already know isn't quite level. You don't drop it, you just notice, with a small private sigh, that the shelf was never as flat as it looked from across the room. Because here's the thing about a golden age, it's real. I want to say that clearly before I show you the cracks in it. The High Republic era genuinely was, by every measure the books give us, the high watermark of the Jedi Order. Thousands of Jedi. Peace across most of the galaxy. A council that mostly settled disputes with patience rather than lightsabers. And still, if you look closely at the actual stories being told in this period, you can find, scattered through them like hairline cracks in a ceiling, you only notice when the light hits just right. The first quiet signs of everything that eventually goes wrong. Not dramatic signs, small ones. The kind you'd only clock if you already knew. The way I do tonight, sitting here with you. What's waiting for this order 1,000 years down the line? The first one is a death, and I promise to tell it gently because it deserves that. In Light of the Jedi, the book that opens this whole era for us, a Jedi Master named Loden Greatstorm is killed by the Nihil in the chaos following the Great Disaster, while trying to save people from the wreckage. His Padawan, a young man named Bel Zetifar, survives and carries that loss through the books that follow. Like a stone in his pocket, he keeps reaching for out of habit. Now, a Jedi Master dying isn't, on its own, some unthinkable rupture in the universe. Jedi die. It's a dangerous life. But here's what matters about the way it lands in the story. This era is supposed to be the Order at its most secure, its most competent, its most trusted. Loden Greatstorm is not a careless Jedi caught off guard by his own arrogance. He's exactly the kind of steady, capable, deeply respected figure the whole Golden Age is built around. And he dies anyway, to an enemy that doesn't play by any rule the Jedi know how to read. It's a small early proof, easy to miss at the time, and I think the Jedi themselves mostly did miss it. The way you miss the first loose stair tread because you've climbed those stairs 1,000 times without thinking. That competence and serenity are not actually armor. They never were. The galaxy just hadn't sent anything hard enough at the Order yet to make that obvious. Here's a smaller crack, and a stranger one, and I like this one, because it isn't about violence at all. It's about the heart, which is somehow always more dangerous to write stories about than blasters are. There's a Jedi in these novels named Elzar Mann. He starts as a Jedi Knight and rises to Master across the era. And he is, by every account the books give, gifted, a strong connection to the Force, well-liked, respected. He also has an unusually close bond with Avar Kriss, the Marshal of Starlight Beacon we talked about a little while ago. A closeness the books let sit right at the edge of what the Code is comfortable with, without ever needing to spell out exactly where the edge is. And over the course of the era, Elzar starts drifting, not toward villainy, nothing so simple as that, but toward a kind of Force philosophy the Council finds unsettling. He becomes drawn to something the books call leaning into the living Force, rather than the more disciplined traditional teachings that emphasize control and detachment. He starts trusting instinct and feeling over doctrine, and some of the people around him, and some of the readers, honestly, which is its own quiet little detail, start to worry, gently at first, and then less gently, that what looks like spiritual openness might also be the exact shape a slide toward the dark side would take, if it were being polite about it. I want to be careful here, because this is where fact and fan reading start to blur, and part of my job tonight is keeping that line visible, even when I'm tired, and the room is warm, and it would be so easy to just blur it myself. What's confirmed, plainly, is that Elzar Mann's arc across the High Republic novels is written as a genuine, ongoing tension between attachment, instinct, and the Jedi's more austere teachings. That's just what's on the page. What's a theory? One that a lot of readers hold, and that I think is a fair one to hold loosely, is that his story is meant as a kind of quiet rehearsal, centuries early, for exactly the tension that eventually swallows Anakin Skywalker whole. The same fault line, dressed differently, showing up first in a much smaller, much gentler way. In a Jedi Master nobody in the wider galaxy will ever have heard of by the time the Clone Wars start. If that's true, it's a lovely piece of design. If it isn't, it's still a true and interesting thing that happened, on its own terms, 1,000 years before Anakin was born. A Jedi feeling the exact same pull, and the Order not quite knowing. Then either what to do with a feeling instead of a fact. Let me set down a third thing now, and this one isn't inside the Order at all. It's about how the galaxy looks at the Order from the outside, which the Jedi, bless them, are not always brilliant at checking. Not everyone in this golden age loves the Jedi. That might sound obvious once you say it out loud, but it's worth actually saying, because the way these stories usually get summarized makes it sound like the High Republic was just wall-to-wall gratitude and gleaming architecture. It wasn't. There's a movement in this era called the Path of the Open Hand, a religious group, genuinely devout in its own way, built around the belief that leaning too hard on technology corrupts a person's connection to the Force, and that the Jedi, with their starships and their beacon stations and their whole gleaming institutional machinery, might not be the pure conduit for the Force that everyone assumes they are. It's led by a figure known simply as the Mother, and it draws in ordinary people, frightened people mostly, people rattled by the nihil and looking for a calmer place to put their faith than an Order that flies in from the core to help and then flies out again. And here's the detail I find genuinely touching in a sad way. This movement eventually becomes entangled through a young woman named Marda Rowe with the very nihil the Jedi are fighting. Marda being, as it happens, the sister of that patient man with his father's old radio, Martian Rowe, whose slow climb we were tracing a little while ago. So, even the resistance to the Jedi's authority and the growth of the thing hunting them turn out to be quietly, humanly tangled together through one ordinary family. Rather than being two separate problems, the Order could solve one at a time. None of that is a criticism of the Jedi, exactly. Plenty of religious and political institutions get resented by at least some of the people they're meant to be helping. That's just what it is, to hold visible power for a long time. But it matters for tonight's story, because it tells you something about the shape of the Golden Age that the beacon and lightsaber version of events tends to leave out, even at their peak, even fully trusted by the Republic's government, backed by more Jedi than have probably ever existed at once before or since. The Order was never quite as universally beloved, or as universally understood, as its own self-image suggested. There were already people out there, quiet, scattered, easy to overlook, who looked at Starlight Beacon and didn't see a beacon of hope so much as a very large, very confident lighthouse, built by people who'd never once asked if the ships wanted guiding. I only mention it because it's good to remember, going forward, that the Jedi's blind spots weren't only about the dark side creeping up on them from outside. Some of them were about simply not noticing how they looked from a little further off. Keep that thought folded up small somewhere. We'll need it again later, much later, when we get to a young man who grew up outside the Order's gaze entirely, and never did learn to trust the lighthouse. For now, though, let's set that whole shelf of High Republic material gently back where it belongs. The beacon, the nihil, the mother and her open hand, Marder Ro's sad, tangled family, and pick up a smaller, plainer object. One rule, just the one, to begin with, because if we're going to understand how the Jedi eventually walked into their own downfall with their eyes open, this is probably the single most load-bearing piece of furniture in the whole room. It's the ban on attachment. Here's the plain version of it. No dressing up. Jedi are not permitted to form attachments. Not to people. Not to possessions. Not really to outcomes at all. No spouses. No children. Nothing you'd cling to so hard that losing it would break you. This is confirmed, textbook Jedi doctrine, stated plainly across the films and reinforced constantly in the Clone Wars. Attachment is treated as the doorway drug to the dark side, the first small step on a path that ends, if you walk it far enough, in fear, and then in anger, and then in something much worse than either. And I want to be fair to it, because it's easy, with 1,000 years of hindsight and a comfortable blanket, to sit here and say what a terrible rule that was. It wasn't stupid. It came from somewhere real. If you can lose the thing you love most, then whoever threatens that thing has a leash on you. And a Jedi with a leash on them is a Jedi who can be bent, bargained with, broken. Take away the leash, the thinking goes, and you get a being who can act with total clarity, who can walk into a burning building or a losing battle and make the correct choice instead of the desperate one, because there's nothing personal left for them to protect. It's a rule built by people trying to manufacture a kind of moral incorruptibility. You can respect the ambition of that, even while you watch, over the length of this whole story, exactly how it fails. Because here's the thing the Order kept insisting, right up until the very end, and it's worth saying slowly because it's easy to blur past it. They did not ban compassion, they banned attachment. Those two words get treated as basically interchangeable by a lot of people who've only half remembered the lore, and the Jedi themselves worked hard to keep them separate. Yoda actually says this out loud in Attack of the Clones to Anakin, almost gently. That attachment leads to jealousy, that the shadow of greed, that is, and then, in the very same breath, that compassion, which he would say is central to a Jedi's life, is unconditional. It requires no attachment in return. So, the distinction the Order was drawing, in theory, was a fairly delicate one. You're allowed, even required, to love the whole galaxy. Every stranger, every creature, every person in trouble who crosses your path. That's not just permitted, that's the job. What you're not allowed to do is love one person so specifically, so possessively, that you'd choose them over everyone else if it came down to it. Compassion spreads outward, evenly, like light from a room with the door open. Attachment gathers inward, toward one person, like a room with the door shut and the heating turned right up. It's a genuinely thoughtful distinction on paper. And I think most human beings, if you ask them to actually live inside it, day after day, decade after decade, no exceptions, would tell you it's about as easy to maintain as keeping a perfectly tidy desk in a house with a 5-year-old in it. Theoretically possible. Practically, something's going to end up in the wrong drawer. Which brings us, gently, to Anakin Skywalker. Because there's no point to pretending this rule matters in the abstract, when it has a face, and the face is his. Here's what's confirmed, plainly, across the films. Anakin Skywalker was brought to the Jedi Temple on Coruscant at 9 years old, considerably older than the norm, which the Council itself points out. Because most younglings begin their training as infants, before they've had the chance to form the very attachments the Order is trying to prevent. Anakin arrives already having lived a childhood. He has a mother, Shmi Skywalker, whom he loves and whom he is forced to leave behind on Tatooine as a slave, because Qui-Gon Jinn can only free the boy in that single moment of the pod race wager, not the woman who raised him. That's not a small footnote. That's the entire rulebook of Jedi detachment, arriving 9 years too late for the one student it most needed to reach early. Master Yoda, when he tests the boy, senses exactly this. Fear, he says, fear of loss, and asks Anakin what he is afraid to lose. And Anakin, being 9 and being honest, simply says his mother. Yoda's response, warm as it might have sounded in the moment, is essentially, that fear is a danger to you, and you'll need to learn to let it go. Which is a very reasonable thing to say to a Jedi trainee in theory, and a slightly extraordinary thing to say to a child who watched his own mother enslaved a week earlier in practice. I don't say that to score a cheap point against Yoda, who I think, across this whole saga, comes out as one of the wisest and most self-aware people in it. Eventually, he's one of vanishingly few Jedi who ever really reckons with what the Order got wrong, later, when it's almost too late to matter. I say it because it's the cleanest possible illustration of the gap between the rule and the reality it was meant to govern. The Order's whole system for producing detached, clear-headed Jedi depends on starting with a blank slate. An infant with no memories yet of a mother's hands, no habit of home. Anakin was never a blank slate. He came preloaded, so to speak, with exactly the kind of love the whole training program was built to prevent. And the Council took him in anyway, partly because Qui-Gon insisted, partly, we're told, because of the sheer scale of his midi-chlorian count, higher, canon tells us, than even Yoda's, and partly, one suspects, because turning away a 9-year-old who's already tasted freedom for the first time in his life would have felt, even to the Council, like a small cruelty they didn't want on their conscience. So they let the exception in, and then spent the rest of his childhood asking him to become someone the exception made almost impossible to become. Now, none of that is speculation, by the way. The age, the mother, the midi-chlorian detail, Yoda's line about fear, all of that is straightforwardly in the films. What I'm doing, gently, is just laying it out next to itself so you can see the shape of it. The way you might set two mismatched shoes side by side on the mat and realize, oh, that's why the whole walk felt uneven. The attachment rule tightens its grip as Anakin grows, and this is where the story most people already half know comes in, though I want to walk through it slowly, rather than rush to the part everyone remembers. Anakin, as a young man, meets Padme Amidala again. They'd met once before, on Tatooine, when she was a young queen he'd known as Attack of the Clones opens, and the two of them fall in love while escorting each other through danger on Geonosis and beyond, and eventually, secretly, they marry. Secretly, because a marriage would be the single clearest, most legible violation of the whole attachment doctrine imaginable. Not a private feeling the Council could plausibly overlook, but a public institution, a ring, a vow, a life. Confirmed in the films, they marry in secret at the end of Attack of the Clones, on Naboo, with only a protocol droid and an astromech present as witnesses, which, if you think about it for a moment, is one of the loneliest images in the whole saga. Two people binding their lives together with nobody there who loves them enough, or is allowed to know them well enough, to stand as a witness who matters. And here's a detail I think gets underused, because it's less dramatic than the wedding, but tells you more about how the rule actually worked. Day to day, inside the temple, nobody catches him, not for years. Anakin Skywalker, a Jedi Knight, a general in the Clone Wars, fights alongside Obi-Wan Kenobi for years while secretly married. And the Council, an institution built, in theory, around beings who can sense emotional turbulence in the Force the way you or I might notice a draft under a door, simply does not see it, or doesn't want to, or sees something and reads it as ordinary strain, ordinary wartime fatigue, rather than the specific shape of a man trying to hold two entirely separate lives in the same two hands. Obi-Wan himself, his closest friend, doesn't find out until the very end. That's not a small oversight for an order that prides itself on being able to read a being's feelings like weather. It's a genuinely strange gap in their own instrument, and it's worth sitting with, rather than rushing past, because it tells you the ban on attachment wasn't just a rule the Order enforced on its members from the outside. It had become, by this point, something closer to a rule the members were quietly, individually responsible for policing in themselves, in private, with no real mechanism for anyone to check the work, which is a very unusual thing to build an entire moral architecture on, an honor system, essentially, for the single hardest human feeling there is to report on yourself honestly. The Clone Wars, the animated series, spends a good deal of its runtime quietly pulling at this same thread, and it does it with more patience and more sympathy than the films always have room for. There's Ahsoka Tano, Anakin's own Padawan, assigned to him as a 14-year-old at the start of the war, and the bond between a Jedi Master and a Padawan is, notably, one of the forms of closeness the Order does sanction, does build its entire training model around, a closeness that in any other context would look an awful lot like attachment, but gets a different name here, mentorship, because it's structured, because it's meant to end, because the Padawan is meant to eventually be knighted and sent off, the bond loosening on schedule like a plant being gradually moved out of a heated greenhouse. Anakin and Ahsoka's relationship never quite loosens on schedule. He worries about her the way you'd worry about a daughter, not a colleague. And the show doesn't hide that, doesn't really try to. It's one of the more tender, ongoing threads in the whole series, and it's also, quietly, another data point in the same argument, that the Order's careful line between compassion and attachment, however sound it looked in a lecture hall, kept blurring the moment it met an actual relationship between two actual people who spent years together in danger. And I think this is the part worth falling asleep on, if you're starting to feel the pull of it now, because there's no need to fight that. There's genuinely nothing here you need to hold on to by morning. The ban on attachment wasn't a mistake because the Jedi were foolish, or because the writers wanted a tidy villain-making machine. It was a mistake, if it was one, because it asked something of its members that most sentient beings simply cannot sustainably do. Not once, not for one dramatic moment of self-sacrifice, but continuously, for a lifetime, while also asking them to be endlessly compassionate toward everyone else in the galaxy at the very same time. Endless outward love permitted, any inward love forbidden. It's a beautiful shape on a page. It is, in practice, very nearly impossible to live inside without something eventually cracking quietly, in a back room of a person's heart, where nobody else, not even an order full of beings who can sense fear and anger from across a temple, happens to be looking. And while that crack was slowly widening inside the Jedi Order, a different kind of order was being established, far away from the light. It was happening in the quietest possible way. Think of it as a separate room, elsewhere in the galaxy, being slowly, meticulously tidied. While the Jedi Temple was filled with thousands of voices, thousands of rules, thousands of complicated relationships to navigate, this other room was being emptied of everything but two essential things: a master and an apprentice. This is where we need to talk, just for a little while, about the Sith. And if the names and the histories are just sounds in the dark as you lie there, that's perfectly fine. Let them be. All you need to know is that for a very long time, the Sith were a lot like the Jedi in one specific way. There were a lot of them. They had empires, armies, academies. They were a loud, visible, chaotic force in the galaxy. And their biggest weakness was, ironically, themselves. They were prone to infighting, to betrayal, to ambitious Dark Lords carving out their own little factions, and then turning on each other. Their power, spread among so many, kept devouring itself. And then, about 1,000 years before the Clone Wars, a Sith Lord named Darth Bane had a very simple, very tidy, and very patient idea. He looked at the chaos of his own order and realized that the dark side of the Force wasn't meant to be shared. It wasn't a communal wellspring like the light. It was a fire, and the more people who tried to draw from it, the more it was diminished, scattered into 1,000 smaller, weaker flames. He believed power needed to be concentrated, to be absolute. So he created what came to be known as the Rule of Two. It's such a simple, elegant piece of terrifying philosophy. There would only ever be 2 Sith Lords at any one time, no more. A master to embody the power and the knowledge of the dark side, and an apprentice to crave that power, to learn from the master, and one day to become strong enough to kill the master and take their place. The apprentice would then find their own apprentice, and the cycle would continue. It's a system where ambition and betrayal aren't a weakness to be managed. They are the engine of progress. It ensures that each new generation is, by definition, stronger than the last. It's the single most ruthless succession plan imaginable, and it worked. Bane destroyed the old, fractured Sith Order and took his own apprentice, and then they vanished. They went into hiding. They became a myth. The Jedi, after a great and final battle, believed the Sith were extinct. They had won. And for 1,000 years, that's what the galaxy believed. And here's the part that feels so important, the part that fits so neatly next to the Jedi's own internal struggles. The Rule of Two wasn't just a military strategy. It was an act of supreme, almost geological patience. Imagine it, 1,000 years, generation after generation of Sith masters and apprentices, living in the shadows, passing down their knowledge, their hatred, and their singular goal, the destruction of the Jedi Order. They weren't rushing. They weren't building fleets or conquering planets. They were just waiting. They were a secret, passed down in a straight, unbroken line, while the Jedi operated in the open, a massive, public institution with all the complexities and vulnerabilities that come with it. The Jedi were trying to police a galaxy. The Sith were just polishing a weapon, and the nature of that weapon was secrecy. Because they were only 2, they could move through the galaxy unseen. They could accumulate wealth, influence, and political power without anyone ever knowing who or what they truly were. They could be a senator, a wealthy benefactor, a trusted advisor. They could study the Jedi from a distance, learn their weaknesses, watch how they became entangled with the politics of the Galactic Republic, a republic the Jedi had sworn to protect. They watched as the Jedi became more rigid, more dogmatic, more reliant on their ancient texts and their High Council, and less able to see a threat that didn't announce itself with a declaration of war. The Jedi were looking for an army. The Sith had become a virus. And that quiet, patient plan, unfolding over centuries, was designed to exploit the very cracks we were just talking about. The Sith understood attachment. They weaponized it. The rule of two is, in its own dark way, a kind of attachment, a bond of hatred, ambition, and envy. The Sith didn't try to suppress these feelings. They cultivated them, refined them into a tool. They knew that an order that forbade love, that feared connection, that taught its members to sever their ties to the outside world, would have a critical blind spot. They would be unable to understand an enemy who used love perverted and twisted, but love all the same as a path to power. The love for a mother, the fear of losing a wife, the protective bond for a secret child. These weren't weaknesses to a Sith. They were doorways. They were levers to be pulled. So, for a millennium, the Jedi's story and the Sith's story run in parallel, one in the light, one in the dark. The Jedi grow more numerous, more powerful in the eyes of the galaxy, building their great temple on Coruscant, becoming a pillar of the Republic. And with every passing year, they become a little more complacent, a little more certain that their ancient enemy is gone for good. And the Sith grow stronger in secret, their power concentrating, their plans becoming more refined, until all that patience is ready to bear its terrible fruit. They were simply waiting for the right Jedi, at the right time. Someone with too much compassion, too much love, and a heart full of cracks that the Jedi Order itself had forbidden him from ever trying to mend. And so, we come to the architects of the final act, the last two names in that long, dark chain of master and apprentice, the ones who would finally bring that 1,000-year-old weapon to bear. Darth Plagueis and his apprentice, a young man from the serene and beautiful planet of Naboo, named Palpatine. Let's just rest on that first name for a moment, Darth Plagueis. Even his title in the Sith legends that Palpatine later recounts is revealing. He wasn't called Plagueis the Conqueror or the Destroyer. He was known as Darth Plagueis the Wise. His power wasn't primarily martial. He wasn't a duelist or a general. He was a scholar of the dark side, a scientist of the unnatural. His grand obsession, the project that consumed his entire life, was not galactic conquest, but the conquest of life itself. He believed that the ultimate power was the ability to cheat death, to command the very building blocks of existence. The midi-chlorians, those microscopic life forms that connect all living things to the Force and bend them to his will. It's a strange and chilling thought, isn't it? While the Jedi were meditating on how to let go of life and release themselves into the cosmic force, Plagueis was in a hidden laboratory somewhere, trying to crack the code of creation. He wanted to unravel the secret of immortality, not for the good of all, but for the preservation of one, himself. And in his hubris, he sought to create life from nothing, to use the dark side to will a being into existence. It was the ultimate act of control, the total opposite of the Jedi philosophy of surrender and trust in the Force. The Jedi listened to the will of the Force. Plagueis wanted to write it himself, and into this scholar's orbit came the perfect instrument, his apprentice, who would take the name Darth Sidious. Palpatine was everything Plagueis was not. Where the master was a reclusive theorist, the apprentice was a public prodigy, a brilliant, ambitious, and deeply charismatic politician. He understood that while Plagueis might hold the key to cosmic power, real, tangible power over the galaxy lay in its institutions, in its senates, its trade guilds, its courts, and its armies. He saw the Republic not as a monolithic ideal to be smashed, but as a complex, decaying machine full of levers and switches, just waiting for the right hand to operate them. So they formed a partnership of perfect dark symmetry. Plagueis, the master, worked in the shadows, pursuing his esoteric goal of manipulating the Force itself. And Sidious, the apprentice, worked in the blinding light of the public eye, rising through the political ranks of his homeworld and, eventually, to the Galactic Senate on Coruscant. No one suspected the charming, unassuming senator from Naboo. He was a friend to the Jedi, a patriot, a servant of the Republic. He was the most dangerous thing in the galaxy, hiding in the one place no one would ever think to look, right next to them, smiling. Together, they put the final pieces of the grand plan into place. While Plagueis delved into secrets of life and death, Sidious wove a web of corruption, debt, and obligation throughout the Senate. He learned every dirty secret, every hidden ambition, every weak point in the Republic's political armor. He studied the Jedi Council from up close, noting their arrogance, their frustrating adherence to protocol, their political blindness. He saw how they had become entangled in the very system they were sworn to protect, and he knew that he could use that system to tie their hands. Now, here's a theory that many people hold to, a piece of cosmic poetry that is too perfect to ignore. Some believe that Plagueis' great experiment, his attempt to bend the Force to his will and create life, was so profound, so unnatural, that the Force itself recoiled, that it sought to balance the scales. And in this great rebalancing, it conceived a child of its own, born without a father, on a remote desert planet, a boy with a connection to the Force so powerful it was without precedent, a virgins, a chosen one. The ultimate irony would be that the Sith Lord who tried to create a perfect living weapon through the dark side inadvertently caused the Force to create its own answer. You don't need to hold on to that as fact, but it's a nice thought to drift on. That the Sith's greatest act of hubris may have created the very person destined to destroy them. But the Sith way is the way of betrayal. It is the core of their philosophy. The apprentice must, eventually, supplant the master. And Palpatine, Darth Sidious, was the perfect student. He learned everything his master had to teach him about the dark side, about the grand plan, about the nature of power. And then, as Palpatine himself would one day tell a young and troubled Anakin Skywalker in a quiet box at the opera, once he knew all his master's secrets, he killed him in his sleep. Plagueis the Wise, who could supposedly keep others from dying, could not save himself. And with that quiet, pathetic murder, the 1,000-year plan came to rest on the shoulders of one being, Darth Sidious. The plan was no longer a shared inheritance. It was his. All the patience, all the secrets, all the accumulated power of generations of Sith Lords were now concentrated in this one man. A man who was, by this point, a respected and influential Chancellor of the Galactic Republic. The weapon wasn't just polished anymore. It was in position, aimed at the heart of the Jedi Order, and Sidious had already identified the perfect trigger. He had engineered a trade dispute around his homeworld of Naboo, a crisis that would allow him to rise to power. A crisis that would bring a Jedi Master and his apprentice to a forgotten planet in the Outer Rim. A crisis that would lead them to a small, gifted, hopeful boy with a heart full of love for his mother. A heart full of attachments. A heart full of cracks, just waiting for the right voice to whisper into them. The final pieces were moving on the board, and the Jedi, for all their wisdom and all their power, couldn't see the player. They were too busy looking at the game, and that is where our story ends for tonight. The board is set. The final pieces are in motion, caught in a current far older and deeper than any of them know. You don't need to see the game play out. You don't need to watch the final fateful moves. We've seen all we needed to see. The long, slow, quiet preparation for the storm. The story isn't about the single flash of lightning. It's about the 1,000 years of changing pressure in the air. All the long threads we've followed this evening. The grand projects of the High Republic, the rigid doctrines of the Jedi Code, the patient, hidden malice of the Sith. They have all been put in their place now. The room is tidy, the story is set, and there is nothing left for you to hold on to. The names can become just sounds now. Coruscant, Camino, Naboo. They can all drift away like distant stars. The faces of the Jedi Masters, the shadows of the Sith Lords. They can all fade into the soft darkness behind your eyes. Let the weight of the story settle and then dissolve. Let the great, complicated web of choices and consequences, of rules and rebellions, go soft and hazy at the edges. There is nothing left to figure out, nothing to remember. It was just a story to keep you company as you drifted towards sleep. A quiet hum in the background of the evening. There is only the quiet now, the space for you to rest, the slow, gentle rhythm of your own breathing. Allow every thought to become heavy, too heavy to hold. Let it all go. There is nothing else you need to do. Rest well. And so we leave them there, poised on the edge of the storm. The final pieces are moving, caught in a current far older and deeper than any of them know. The board is set, but you don't need to see the game play out. You don't need to watch the final, fateful moves. Our story tonight was never about the single flash of lightning that lit up the sky. It was about the 1,000 years of changing pressure in the air that made the storm inevitable. And now, the air is still. The story is told. All the long threads we've followed this evening. The grand, sunlit projects of the High Republic, the rigid, hallowed doctrines of the Jedi Code, the patient, hidden malice of the Sith. They have all been put in their proper place now. The room is tidy, the history is settled, and there is nothing left for you to hold on to. The names can become just sounds now. Coruscant, Camino, Naboo. Just soft syllables drifting away on the quiet air. The faces of the Jedi Masters, the shadows of the Sith Lords, they can all fade into the gentle darkness behind your eyes. Let them go soft at the edges, and then let them dissolve completely. Let the weight of the story settle, and then release it. The great, complicated web of choices and consequences, of rules and rebellions, can go hazy now. There is nothing left to figure out, nothing to remember. It was just a story to keep you company as you drifted towards sleep. A quiet hum in the background of the evening. There is only the quiet now, the space for you to rest, the slow, gentle tide of your own breathing. Feel it pull you away from the shore of the day, out into the calm, deep ocean of sleep. Allow every thought to become heavy, too heavy to hold. Let it all go. There is nothing else you need to do. Just rest. Let the quiet hold you. Let the darkness be a comfort. Sleep well. And so, the great wheel of this story turns to its final quiet resting place. The long history is told. All the threads we followed tonight. The bright, hopeful tapestry of the High Republic. The stern, tightly woven rules of the Jedi Code. The single dark thread of the Sith, running unseen through it all. We can fold them all up now, gently, and put them away. There is nothing more to hold. The names are just echoes now. Qui-Gon, Mace Windu, Yoda. Let them become whispers, and then silence. The Grand Temple on Coruscant can shrink to a distant light, and then go out. The final battle is long over. The dust has settled for 1,000 years. All is quiet, and in that quiet, there is only you, safe in your own space. The story has done its work. It was just a companion for the dark. A soft murmur to fill the stillness as you let the day fall away. Feel the weight of the blanket. Notice the gentle rhythm of your own breathing. That is the only story that matters now. The simple, peaceful story of your body at rest. Let everything else go soft. Let the edges of thought blur and dissolve into the darkness. There is nowhere else to be, nothing else to do. Just rest. Rest well. And so the last page is turned. The long story of the Jedi's fall is now complete. All the pieces have been returned to the box. The grand saga, the small moments of choice, the vast sweep of history. It can all be put on the shelf now, to gather dust in the quiet. The only thing that remains in the room is you, and the stillness, the feeling of the air on your skin, the gentle weight of the blanket holding you, the simple, steady rhythm of your own breath, rising and falling without any effort at all. That is the only story now. There is nothing left for your mind to do. No more threads to follow. No puzzles to solve. Let any lingering thoughts become like distant stars in a vast, dark sky. You can see them, but they ask nothing of you. Let them fade, one by one, into the soft, deep velvet of the night. All that is left is to rest. Allow the deep peace of this moment to carry you into sleep. Let the darkness be a safe harbour, a quiet port at the end of a long journey. Rest now, sleep well, and so the journey ends. The great star chart we have been following. All those points of light marking worlds and choices can be rolled up now and tied with a ribbon and put away on a high, quiet shelf. The path has been walked. The destination has been reached. The names no longer need to be held. The dates and the battles can drift away like smoke on the evening air. The vast galactic history can now become a quiet hum in the far distance, and then nothing at all. It has served its purpose. It has kept you company on your own quiet journey towards rest. All that is left is the gentle gravity of this moment, the simple, peaceful weight of your body, resting, the quiet space around you, the gentle rise and fall of your chest. This is the only universe that matters now, small and safe and still. Let every last thought be like a train pulling out of a station in the deep of the night. You can hear its distant whistle as it fades, leaving behind only a profound and welcome silence. There is nowhere else to travel tonight. The journey is done. All that remains is to rest in the stillness. Sleep now, rest well.